situation. Stalin said in the beginning of the 1930s, perhaps, and by that time he was the undisputed or most important leader, maybe not undisputed, but certainly the most important leader within the Soviet party and within the Soviet state. Stalin said, "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries," meaning the Western capitalist countries. "We must make good this difference in 10 years." So he says we're behind 50 to 100 years, but we have to catch up in 10 years. And then he says, either we do it or we shall be crushed. And again, I want to start there. And Carlos, we're not quoting Stalin because we're looking at the history through the lens of heroes and traitors, the great leaders. There are heroes, there are traitors, there are great leaders. But Stalin is now the leader of the Soviet Union, and he's making the pitch for collectivization and industrialization on the basis that if they don't catch up in 10 years, that which they lack, 50 or 100 years of development, they will be crushed. Anyway, I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, agreed. You know, there was this big shift towards the end of the 1920s in terms of the global situation and how that impacted the domestic situation in the Soviet Union, as you've said. I think in the mid-1920s, the Soviet leadership had made this assessment, this appraisal of global capitalism, that it had entered a period of relative stability after the war. It was no longer a period of revolution, at least in Europe and the Americas. Of course, the Chinese Revolution was gathering pace. But World War I was over, the war of intervention against Russia was over, and it was perhaps understood in the West that the Bolsheviks weren't just a flash in the pan. They weren't going to go away overnight. And there was even some possibility of normalizing relations between the Soviet Union and the capitalist world, of enjoying some sort of stability, even if it was temporary, to enjoy what Lenin referred to as peaceful coexistence, and then was reused in a somewhat different context by Khrushchev after the war. And that relatively stable regional and global environment encourages slow and steady internal development because it provides a level of breathing space. The NEP, the New Economic Policy, with its mixed economy, relative freedom for small capitalists, for rich farmers, might be expected to carry on for a long time because it was essentially quite a relaxed environment with a minimum of class struggle. The rich were allowed to continue being rich as long as they accepted the basic socialist trajectory of society. And I think that's not entirely unlike China under reform and opening up. And actually, that parallel is important. I think it's something that we could perhaps discuss in future episodes, because China's reform was also predicated on this idea of relative stability in the external environment. So it felt like, I think, quite a positive environment. Living standards are improving. There's a lot of intellectual freedom. From a cultural point of view, the revolution was moving forward. There was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm, of creative energy, of experimentation. There was an explosion of popular culture, mass literacy, folk music, theatre, youth culture, and so on. And then, as you've alluded to, the big change in the global environment was, of course, the biggest economic crisis in the history of capitalism, starting with the Wall Street crash of 1929, leading to mass unemployment, the Great Depression. And actually, the Soviets were the only ones that had really foreseen this, and they talked about it as early as 1927 and the 15th Congress of the CPSU. But that very quickly changed the overall mood, the overall dynamic. It overturned the sense of stability because being Marxists, the Bolsheviks knew very well that capitalist crisis tends to be accompanied by certain social phenomena. One of those being the rise of the left, as working class people who always bear the brunt of the crisis realize that their survival is predicated on collective organization, on collective struggle. But in response to the rise of the left, then the capitalist class is perfectly capable of resorting to violence and coercion in order to protect itself, in order to protect the basic structure of the capitalist system. And as we know only too well, that coercion numerous times in the 20th century took the form of fascist paramilitary force. So this period of relative stability was transformed quite suddenly into a powder keg, into a very precarious, very fragile situation. And of course, that hangs off capitalist crisis is war, being the ultimate means to kickstart an economy, what Mandel later referred to as military Keynesianism, and a scramble for land, a scramble for resources, for markets, for cheap labor. And the danger of a new world war in Europe was increasingly well understood by this point. And of course, the basic conditions had been set for it by the Treaty of Versailles following World War I. So this is the big shift that's happening externally to the Soviet Union. In foreign policy terms, it led to a major turn to the left, with the Comintern adopting class against class, advocating a complete break with social democracy and so on. In domestic policy, there was also a turn to the left in terms of rapid industrialization, rapid collectivization. And I think we're going to talk about the foreign policy and the Comintern line a bit later. And I think ultimately it turned out to be incorrect and to not accurately reflect the actual balance of forces in the West. But the domestic changes, I think, were indispensable. The gradualism of the NEP era had ceased to be viable. The Soviets knew perfectly well that they would be targeted in any world war. In a scramble for land, in a scramble for resources, there's no way the imperialist powers would leave this enormous landmass of Russia, Central Asia, the Caucasus alone. And as you've quoted, Stalin said, we catch up with the advanced capitalist countries within 10 years or we'll be crushed. He made that remark in 1931. 10 years later, the Nazis launched their onslaught on Russia. So whatever one thinks of Stalin, you sort of have to accept that this comment was pretty spot on, a very accurate appraisal of the overall global situation and the Soviet Union's place within it. So that, I think, is the global context for the very frenetic socialist construction of the 1930s.